The night air was thick with an unsettling stillness as Isabel Carr navigated his way through the familiar streets of Winterdale. The glow of his car's dashboard softly illuminated his face, reflecting the weight of a day spent in the courtroom. As a judge, he'd long been accustomed to long hours and difficult decisions, but tonight the burden felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the cases that had passed through his bench, stories of injustice, broken lives, and the grinding wheel of a system that seemed increasingly flawed. Or maybe it was something more personal, something deeper that he couldn't yet name. Winterdale had been his home for years, a town that prided itself on its charm and prosperity. But beneath the pristine surface of manicured lawns and picket fences, Isabel knew a different reality. As one of the few black men in positions of authority in this mostly white town, he had felt the subtle, often unspoken undercurrents of prejudice. He'd seen how the law, which was supposed to protect and serve, could also be wielded as a weapon of control, suspicion, and fear. But none of that should have mattered now, not here, not to him. He was Isabel Carr, an honorable judge, a pillar of the community, respected for his fairness and integrity. Yet, as his hands gripped the steering wheel of his sleek, black sedan, a well-earned reward for his years of dedication, the familiar unease crept in. The kind of unease that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with being seen as out of place. Despite the success and respect he had earned, Winterdale still wasn't a place where a black man in a luxury car could simply be without question. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror snapped him out of his thoughts. The wail of a siren cut through the quiet night, sending a jolt of adrenaline coursing through his veins. His heart skipped a beat, followed by a familiar sinking sensation. His stomach tightened as the realization set in. He was being pulled over. Isabel instinctively glanced at the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. The car was new, the plates were up to date, and there was no obvious reason for him to be stopped. No reason, except the one that gnawed at the back of his mind. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves as he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The police cruiser behind him slowed to a stop, its lights flashing brightly in the darkness. The sharp contrast between the quiet neighborhood and the piercing red and blue illuminated the scene with an eerie intensity. Isabel's hands rested firmly on the steering wheel as he watched the officer step out of her vehicle. His pulse quickened. He knew what was coming, and despite everything he had achieved, everything he represented, there was a cold reality to what was about to unfold. The officer approached his window, her figure casting a long shadow against the car's polished exterior. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who knew her power. Her name tag gleamed under the streetlights, Officer Roses. But it wasn't the name that caught his attention, it was the look in her eyes. Cold, suspicious, as if she had already made up her mind about him before he even rolled down the window. License and registration, she demanded curtly, her voice sharp and devoid of pleasantries. Isabel felt the knot in his chest tighten. He had seen this before countless times, in fact, from the bench, in case after case where a simple traffic stop had escalated into something far worse. But now, it was happening to him. He was no longer Judge Carr, the respected figure in a black robe. He was just another black man behind the wheel of a nice car. "Of course, officer," he replied, keeping his tone measured and calm, though inside his heart was pounding. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his documents. Every movement was careful, controlled. He knew better than to make any sudden gestures, knew too well the dangers of this kind of encounter. As he handed over his license and registration, Officer Roses took them without so much as a glance in his direction. Her eyes were fixed on his car, scanning it with the intensity of someone who had already decided it didn't belong here. The seconds stretched out as she studied the papers in her hand, her expression hard and unreadable. Isabel could feel the tension growing, an invisible force pressing down on him as if the weight of centuries of injustice were settling on his shoulders. Then, without warning, her eyes snapped back to his. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered, her voice laced with an unmistakable edge. Isabel blinked, momentarily stunned by the command. "Excuse me," he asked, the disbelief evident in his voice. He had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for this. He was a judge, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, but none of that seemed to matter. I said, "Step out of the vehicle," she repeated, her hand hovering dangerously close to her gun. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Isabel's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a mix of anger and humiliation burning just beneath the surface. But he knew better than to argue, knew that in situations like this, logic and reason didn't always prevail. This wasn't a courtroom where he could object or present evidence in his defense. This was the street, where the power dynamics were stark and unforgiving. With a deep breath, Isabel unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to cool the fire simmering inside. He stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity in the face of this degrading situation. Hands on the hood, Officer Roses barked. His jaw tightened. The words stung more than they should have, not because they were unfamiliar, but because of what they represented. Every fiber of his being wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, to assert his rights. But he knew that one wrong move, one wrong word, could turn this from bad to catastrophic. Officer Isabel began, his voice calm despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface. "There must be some misunderstanding. I'm Judge Isabel Carr. I live just down the street. If you check." Hands on the hood, she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. With a clenched jaw, Isabel complied. The cool metal of his car's hood pressed against his palms, a stark reminder of how powerless he was in this moment. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him, hidden behind curtains and blinds, silently watching as the man who upheld justice in this town was reduced to a suspect. As Officer Roses began to pat him down, Isabel's mind raced. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every black man who had ever been pulled over for no reason other than the color of their skin. It was about the injustice that lay at the heart of a system he had dedicated his life to defending. "This is unnecessary," he muttered, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We've had reports of a vehicle like this being stolen," Officer Roses replied flatly, her hands moving roughly over his jacket. "This is my car," Isabel shot back, barely keeping his temper in check. "I bought it just a few days ago. If you run the plates, you'll see." Hands on the hood, she snapped, cutting him off once more. The humiliation was complete. Isabel could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the stories of men just like him echoing in his mind. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not to him, not in this way. But it was happening. And it was a stark reminder of the reality he lived in. Just then, Officer Rose's radio crackled to life. "Stand down immediately," a voice commanded. "Judge Carr is a respected member of the community. I'm on my way." The tension in the air shifted, but the damage was already done. Isabel straightened slowly, adjusting his jacket as Officer Roses stepped back, her face flushed with embarrassment. She hesitated for a moment, then muttered, "I'm sorry, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Isabel repeated quietly, his voice cold and distant. That's what they were calling it now, racial profiling, reduced to a mere misunderstanding. Moments later, Captain John arrived, full of apologies and assurances, but Isabel's mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't just about one traffic stop. This was about a system that was broken, a system that saw him as a threat before it saw him as a man. As Captain John spoke, offering his profuse apologies, Isabel made a decision that would change not only his life but the lives of countless others in Winterdale. The tension from the traffic stop lingered long after Isabel had returned home. The soft click of the front door, as he entered, echoed in the silence of the house, but the quiet didn't bring the usual comfort. His wife, Denise, looked up from the couch, her face immediately registering concern as she saw the troubled look in his eyes. "You're late," she said softly, rising to meet him. "What happened?" Isabel took a deep breath, trying to push back the simmering anger he had barely kept in check. But it was no use. The humiliation, the frustration, the deep-rooted injustice of what he had experienced couldn't be buried. I was pulled over, he said, his voice tight. Denise's face fell. Pulled over? What for? They thought I stole my own car. The words felt bitter on his tongue, each one a reminder of the reality he lived in, despite all he had achieved. Denise's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Here? In Winterdale? By who? Officer Rose's Isabel replied, the name alone enough to make his blood boil. She had me get out of the car, hands on the hood, the whole routine. I told her who I was, but she didn't care. It wasn't until Captain John got involved that they finally let me go. Denise's face twisted in anger, her voice trembling. Isabel, this is unacceptable. You're a judge. Everyone in this town knows who you are. How could they? Isabel held up his hand to stop her, his expression grim. That's the point, Denise. It doesn't matter who I am. To her, I was just a black man in a nice car, and that was all she needed to suspect me. Denise's anger quickly gave way to concern, her hand gently resting on his arm. What are you going to do? Isabel sank into the chair, his body heavy with the weight of the evening. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind, but the truth kept coming back to him, sharper and clearer with every thought. I can't let this go, he said quietly, almost to himself. This isn't just about me. This is about something bigger, something that's been happening for years, right under our noses. It's not just one bad cop making a bad judgment call, it's a system that's broken, a system that's been allowed to thrive on prejudice and corruption. Denise knelt beside him, her voice soft but firm. I know you, Isabel. You won't be able to rest until you do something about it. But please, be careful. This town, the people in power, they won't just sit back and let you shake things up. Isabel nodded, but his mind was already made up. I have to speak out. I need to start a conversation, demand reform in the police department. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. As the days passed, Isabel made his decision clear. He brought the incident with Officer Rose's to light, not just as a personal grievance but as a call for accountability. He demanded that the Winterdale Police Department review its practices, implement bias training, and ensure that officers like Rose's were held responsible for their actions. But what began as a plea for reform quickly revealed deeper cracks in the system. It was late one night when Isabel received a phone call that changed everything. Jack, his close friend and longtime confidant within the police force, had been quietly investigating some troubling leads. When Isabel answered, Jack's voice was hushed, almost urgent. Izzy. I've been digging, Jack said, his tone serious. There's something much bigger going on here. It's not just Officer Rose's. There's corruption in the department at the top levels. Isabel sat up straight, his heart pounding. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Apex Builders. They've been paying off officers for years, bribes, hushing up safety violations, falsifying reports. And it's not just a few bad apples, it's widespread. Captain John is involved. He's been covering it up. Isabel's mind raced. Apex Builders was one of the largest construction companies in Winterdale, and they had powerful connections all throughout the town. If what Jack was saying was true, this wasn't just a case of racial bias. This was systemic corruption, and it was deeply entrenched in the very fabric of Winterdale's governance. We need proof, Isabel said, his voice low. If we're going to take this on, we need to gather evidence, something that can't be ignored. I've got some leads, Jack replied, but we need to be careful. People are watching, and if they catch wind of what we're doing. Jack's voice trailed off, but Isabel knew what he meant. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was dangerous. The following weeks were a blur of covert meetings, late-night phone calls, and strategic planning. Isabel and Jack worked in secret, gathering documents, reviewing records, and connecting the dots that linked Apex Builders to the police force. But with every step forward, the risks grew. Isabel's phone rang, constantly anonymous calls, veiled threats, warnings to stop digging before it was too late. Denise grew more anxious, her fears mounting with each passing day. They're watching us, she said one evening, her voice shaking. Isabel, this isn't safe. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Please, just think about what you're risking. I know, Denise Isabel replied, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he was putting his family through. But if I don't do this, who will? The truth has to come out. As the pressure mounted, Isabel reached out to Lisa Chan, a local journalist known for her investigative work. Lisa was relentless in her pursuit of the truth, and she agreed to help expose the corruption. This is bigger than anything we've seen here, Lisa said during one of their meetings, her eyes sharp with determination. Once we have all the evidence, I'll make sure this story goes public. They won't be able to hide anymore. But as they prepared to bring the story to light, the threats escalated. Jack was forced into hiding, moving between safe houses to avoid detection. Isabel's house was under constant surveillance, strange cars parked outside for hours at a time. The tension was suffocating. Then, one night, a brick was thrown through Isabel's front window. A crude message scrawled on the note attached, "Stop, or else." Denise screamed as the glass shattered, and Isabel rushed to her side, his heart pounding with both fear and fury. "This has gone too far," Denise said, her voice trembling. "I can't lose you, Isabel. You have to stop, please." Isabel wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. He knew the risks, and he knew that the people behind Apex Builders and their web of corruption wouldn't stop until they silenced him. But he also knew that if he backed down now, nothing would change. "I can't stop. Denise," he whispered, his voice full of resolve. "Not now. Not when we're this close." The night before the broadcast, Isabel sat alone in his study, the weight of everything bearing down on him. He knew that once the story aired, there would be no turning back. The people of Winterdale would see the truth for what it was, and the powerful would fall. But he also knew that the fight was far from over. He took a deep breath, his thoughts turning to the future, a future where the system was no longer built on prejudice and corruption, a future where justice truly meant something. And with that thought, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. Isabel sat in his office late into the night, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk as he reviewed the files Jack had sent him. The evidence was damning documents, hidden communications, and records of bribes connecting Apex Builders to key figures within the Winterdale Police Department and local government. Jack's investigation had revealed a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Officer Rose's. At the heart of it was Captain John, a man who had sworn to protect the community but had instead aligned himself with powerful corporate interests. As Isabel flipped through the pages, his mind raced. This was no longer just about racial profiling or a single act of discrimination. This was a systematic betrayal of the public trust, a betrayal that had allowed Apex Builders to operate above the law for years. The company had been cutting corners, violating safety regulations, and endangering lives, all while greasing the palms of those in power to keep their crimes buried. It was more than Isabel had ever expected to uncover. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Denise stood there, her face drawn with concern. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. "You need to rest." Isabel sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I can't, Denise. This is bigger than I thought. Jack's found enough evidence to blow this entire town wide open. Apex Builders, Captain John, the police department, they're all involved. If this gets out..." Denise moved closer, her brow furrowed. "But if it gets out, what happens to you? To us? These people won't just sit back and let you expose them. They'll come after you." Isabel looked at her, his expression heavy with the weight of responsibility. "I know, but I can't ignore this. I've spent my entire life fighting for justice, and now I have the chance to do something that matters. I can't walk away." Denise's eyes filled with worry, but she knew her husband's determination. She had seen it time and time again in the courtroom, the way he fought for fairness and equality. But this fight felt different. It was dangerous. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. Isabel nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I promise." But even as he said the words, he knew that nothing was certain. The corruption they were up against wasn't just local, it was deeply embedded in the fabric of Winterdale, and taking it down would come at a cost. The next day, Isabel met Jack in a secluded diner on the outskirts of town. Jack's face was pale, his eyes dark with exhaustion. He had been living on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that his investigation had made him a target. "I've got more," Jack said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "It's everything: payments, emails, contracts. Apex Builders has been funneling money through shell companies, paying off high-ranking officers, including Captain John. And it's not just them. Several city officials are in on it too. They've all been protecting Apex." Isabel took the drive, his heart pounding. "This is it, then. We've got enough to take them down." Jack nodded, but his expression was grim. "Yeah, but they know we're close. I've been getting strange calls. Cars parked outside my house. They're watching us, Isabel. If we don't move fast, they'll bury this and we'll be next." Isabel clenched his fists, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were walking a dangerous line, and they both knew it. "We need to take this to Lisa," he said. "She can get the story out before they have a chance to silence us." Jack leaned back in his chair, his face etched with worry. "Once this goes public, they'll come after us harder. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Isabel's jaw tightened with resolve. "I've come too far to back down now. We have to do this." That evening, Isabel and Jack met with Lisa Chan, the local news producer. Lisa was sharp, fearless, and had a reputation for exposing corruption, no matter the cost. As Isabel laid out the evidence, her expression grew more serious by the minute. "This is huge," she said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "If we go public with this, it's going to shake the entire town. We're talking about bringing down the police department, the mayor, city officials. They'll try to stop us." Isabel nodded. "That's why we need to move quickly. We can't give them time to cover their tracks." Lisa looked at him, her eyes filled with both admiration and concern. "You realize what you're up against, right? These people are powerful. They won't go down without a fight." "I know," Isabel said quietly. "But we can't let them keep getting away with this. The people of Winterdale deserve to know the truth." Lisa nodded, her mind already racing through the logistics. "I'll start working on the story tonight. We'll run it as soon as we have everything in place. But you need to be careful. Once this airs, they'll come after you." Isabel exchanged a glance with Jack, both men fully aware of the danger they were walking into. But there was no turning back now. The tension in the air was palpable. As the days passed and the broadcast drew nearer, Isabel and Jack found themselves living in a state of constant vigilance. The anonymous phone calls became more frequent, the tone more threatening. Isabel noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his house, their occupants watching him with cold, calculating eyes. One evening, as he and Denise sat down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Isabel's stomach tightened. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Stay here," he told Denise, his voice low. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Standing on his porch was a man in a dark suit, his face hard and unreadable. Isabel opened the door slightly, keeping his guard up. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Judge Carr, a word of advice: walk away. You're digging into things that don't concern you." Isabel's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm digging into," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm not stopping." The man's smile faded, his expression turning cold. "That's unfortunate. For you, and for your family." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Isabel standing in the doorway, his blood running cold. Denise appeared behind him, her voice trembling. "Who was that?" Isabel closed the door, his mind racing. "Just someone trying to scare me." "Isabel, this is getting dangerous," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't keep living like this. What if something happens to you? To us?" Isabel turned to her, his face etched with determination. "I'm not backing down, Denise. Not now. We're too close. They're scared because they know we have the truth. And once it's out there, they can't hide anymore." Denise wrapped her arms around him, her voice barely a whisper. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Isabel said, holding her tightly. But in the back of his mind, he knew that careful might not be enough. The day of the broadcast arrived. Isabel sat in his living room, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Denise sat beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. On the television screen, Lisa Chan's face appeared, calm and composed, as she began to reveal the story that would shake Winterdale to its core. "As our investigation has uncovered," Lisa said, her voice steady, Apex Builders, one of the largest companies in Winterdale, has been involved in a years-long corruption scheme involving key members of the police department and city officials. Documents obtained by our sources show that bribes were paid to cover up safety violations and other illegal activities, all with the knowledge of high-ranking officers, including Captain John of the Winterdale Police Department. Isabel's phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, but he ignored them, his focus entirely on the screen. As the story unfolded, the truth was laid bare for all to see. The corruption, the cover-ups, the betrayal of the public trust, it was all there, broadcast for the world to witness. When the broadcast ended, Isabel exhaled, his chest tight with both relief and fear. The truth was out. The fight was far from over, but they had taken the first step. Denise looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and worry. "You did it," she whispered. Isabel nodded, but his mind was already racing. The threats would come. The retaliation would be swift. But for now, they had exposed the darkness, and there was no turning back. The day of the broadcast was a whirlwind of tension and fear. Isabel had spent the entire morning pacing the floor of his office, his mind replaying every possible outcome. He knew once Lisa aired the story, there would be no turning back. The corruption they had uncovered wasn't just a local scandal, it threatened to tear the entire fabric of Winterdale's power structure apart. Jack had gone into hiding, moving between different safe houses after receiving an ominous phone call the night before. "They know we're close," he had told Isabel, his voice strained with exhaustion. "We need to be careful. They'll come after us hard once this hits." Isabel didn't doubt it. He could feel the pressure mounting, the walls closing in as the broadcast time approached. Denise sat across from him in their living room, her eyes shadowed with worry. "What if they come after us, Isabel?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you." Isabel reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll be safe. We have protection now. The state police are watching the house, and once the story is out there, they can't silence us anymore. The truth is too big to hide." Denise nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. She wasn't just worried about the physical dangers, they both knew that their lives would never be the same after this. The town they had called home for so many years would turn against them. Old friends, familiar faces, they would all look at Isabel differently now, not as the respected judge, but as the man who had exposed Winterdale's darkest secrets. At noon, the first part of the story broke. Lisa Chan, with her signature poise and determination, began unraveling the tangled web of corruption that had infiltrated Winterdale's police force and government. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, documents showing payments from Apex Builders to Captain John and other officials, audio recordings of backdoor deals, and interviews with whistleblowers who had come forward once they knew they weren't alone. As the story unfolded on screen, Isabel's phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages poured in from colleagues, friends, and media outlets looking for comments. But amid the flood of notifications was one that sent a chill down his spine. "You think you've won. But this isn't over. We're coming for you." Isabel stared at the message, his heart pounding. He had expected retaliation, but this felt different. It was more personal, more direct. Denise saw the look on his face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with panic. Isabel showed her the message, and Denise's face paled. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice shaky. "This is serious." "We will," Isabel replied, trying to keep his voice calm despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. "But we can't let them scare us into silence. That's what they want." Denise nodded, though her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Isabel knew they were running out of time. Once the story was fully aired, The people behind Apex Builders and the corrupted police force would stop at nothing to protect themselves. But he had come too far, risked too much, to back down now. That night, Lisa aired the final part of the investigation, and it hit Winterdale like a bombshell. Captain John, once the proud face of law enforcement in the town, was implicated in a series of illegal dealings that spanned nearly a decade. His involvement with Apex Builders had ensured that any violations or complaints against the company disappeared before they reached the courts. In exchange, he had received generous kickbacks, all while maintaining his public image as a guardian of the law. As the broadcast ended, Isabel sat back, a mix of relief and apprehension settling over him. The truth was out. They had done it. But the aftermath was immediate. Within hours, protests erupted outside the police station and City Hall. Crowds gathered, demanding accountability and resignations. Captain John had gone into hiding, refusing to answer questions from the press, while city officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The Winterdale community was in an uproar, divided between those who supported the investigation and those who accused Isabel of tarnishing the town's reputation. Isabel watched the protests from his office window, the chants of justice for Winterdale ringing through the streets. He should have felt victorious. This was what they had fought for: the exposure of the truth, the demand for justice. But the threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown more frequent, more aggressive. That night, as Isabel and Denise prepared for bed, there was a sudden knock at the door. Isabel froze, his heart racing. It was too late for a visitor. He exchanged a glance with Denise, who looked just as alarmed. "I'll get it," Isabel said, his voice low as he moved cautiously toward the front door. He peered through the peephole and saw two men standing on the porch, dressed in dark suits. Isabel's stomach dropped. They didn't look like reporters. They didn't look like anyone he recognized. Taking a deep breath, Isabel opened the door slightly, keeping the chain locked. "Can I help you?" One of the men stepped forward, his face expressionless. "Judge Carr, we need to have a word with you." Isabel's grip tightened on the door. "Who are you?" The man's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "We represent certain interests in Winterdale. You've made some powerful enemies, Judge. It would be in your best interest to walk away while you still can." Isabel's heart pounded, but he didn't waver. "I'm not walking away from anything. The truth is out. You can't stop it now." The man's smile faded. "You'd be surprised at what we can stop." He glanced behind Isabel, his eyes lingering on Denise, who stood frozen in the hallway. "Think about your family, Judge. This fight isn't worth losing everything." Isabel's blood ran cold, but his resolve remained firm. "I'm not afraid of you. The law is coming for you and everyone involved. You can't threaten me into silence." The man's expression hardened. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his partner following close behind. Isabel watched them go, his heart racing, his mind filled with a storm of emotions. When he closed the door, Denise rushed to his side, her face pale with fear. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Isabel wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "No," he said quietly. "But neither am I." The following morning, state investigators arrived in Winterdale. The arrests began swiftly, with Captain John at the top of the list. The town was in shock as officers and city officials were led away in handcuffs, their faces plastered across every news outlet in the state. Apex Builders was under federal investigation, and its executives were already fleeing the country to avoid prosecution. But even as justice seemed to prevail, Isabel knew this was only the beginning. The system that had allowed this corruption to fester was still in place, and the people who benefited from it would fight tooth and nail to protect their power. The threats would continue. The fight for justice was far from over. As Isabel stood on the courthouse steps, watching the town he had served for so many years reel from the revelations, he felt a strange mix of hope and determination. They had struck a blow against the system, but there was still much work to be done. Denise stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. "What now?" she asked softly. Isabel looked out at the town, his gaze steady. "Now we keep fighting. For justice. For what's right. We don't stop until the system changes." And with that, Isabel Carr, the man who had brought Winterdale's corruption to its knees, prepared for the next battle in the long war for justice. The aftermath of the broadcast rippled through Winterdale like a tidal wave. It was all anyone could talk about: the scandal, the corruption, the betrayal of trust that had gripped the town for years. Isabel had known this would happen, but seeing it unfold in real time, with every headline and every conversation, made it feel surreal. He had exposed the truth, and now the town had to face the consequences of its rotten core. The arrests came swiftly. Captain John, once the untouchable leader of the police force, was taken into custody. His downfall marked the first of many, as other officers and city officials, all implicated in the widespread corruption scandal, followed. The investigation had opened a Pandora's box, revealing layers of deceit that went deeper than anyone had imagined. But even with Captain John behind bars, Isabel knew that justice wasn't fully served. The system that had allowed men like John to thrive still existed, and the town of Winterdale was far from healed. The wounds ran deep, and there was no quick fix for the years of injustice that had been swept under the rug. Denise stood beside Isabel on the courthouse steps the morning after the first wave of arrests. The air was crisp, the sun barely peeking through the clouds. They hadn't slept much the night before. Too many thoughts, too many worries about what came next. Isabel had expected the relief of victory to feel more substantial, but instead, a new kind of burden weighed on his shoulders. "They're calling for an overhaul of the entire department," Denise said softly, reading through the latest news article on her phone. "There's even talk of dissolving the city council." Isabel nodded, his gaze distant. "It's what needs to happen. The whole system is broken. It's not enough to just remove a few corrupt individuals. We need to rebuild everything from the ground up." Denise slipped her hand into his, sensing the weight he was carrying. "You did it, though. You exposed the truth. That's something no one can take away from you." Isabel squeezed her hand, but his expression remained serious. "The truth is out, yes, but that doesn't mean the fight is over. We've rattled the cage, but the people behind this, they're not done. Apex builders may have been exposed, but the power structures they've built won't crumble overnight. They'll regroup. They'll try to find new ways to stay in control." Denise nodded, understanding all too well. "And you'll be there to stop them?" Isabel gave her a faint smile, though there was little comfort in the moment. "I will. I have to be. But it's not just me, it's the people of this town too. They have to demand better, to keep fighting even when the spotlight moves on." In the days that followed, the town was a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Some residents rallied behind Isabel, praising him for his courage in standing up to corruption, but others weren't so quick to applaud him. There were those who felt betrayed, angry that their peaceful lives had been upended by his revelations. They accused him of stirring the pot, of making the town look bad on a national stage. To them, Winterdale had been a quiet, prosperous town. Why couldn't he have just left well enough alone? Isabel faced these criticisms head-on. In a public forum held at the community center, he stood before a packed room of residents, some of whom glared at him with thinly veiled resentment. Others watched with quiet anticipation, waiting to see what he would say. "I know many of you are angry," Isabel began, his voice steady. "You're angry because the town we thought we knew isn't what it seemed. But the truth is, the problems I've exposed didn't just start when this story broke. They've been here for years, festering in the shadows while we turned a blind eye." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I didn't come forward with this because I wanted to ruin our town's reputation. I did it because I believe in what this town can be, what it should be. A place where justice isn't just for some, but for all. Where the people in power are held accountable, and where every citizen, no matter their background, feels safe and respected." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others folded their arms, still unconvinced. "I understand the fear of change," Isabel continued. "But we can't rebuild this town if we keep pretending everything was fine. It wasn't. And now we have the chance to fix it. We can create something better, something fairer. But it's going to take all of us working together. As he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Not everyone clapped, but enough did for Isabel to know that change, slow as it might be, was on the horizon. Weeks later, the investigations continued. More officials were implicated, and Winterdale's government was in the process of being restructured. Jack, still in hiding but now working with federal investigators, sent Isabel updates from time to time. The two friends, once bound by their shared goal of exposing the truth, had grown even closer through the ordeal, despite the distance between them. "You did good," Izzy Jack said during one of their brief phone calls. "The town's going to be better for this. It'll take time, but they're on the right track now." Isabel smiled, though his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "Thanks, Jack. Couldn't have done it without you." Jack chuckled. "Yeah, well, don't go giving me too much credit. I'm just glad we survived it." "Me too," Isabel said, his voice soft but sincere. "Me too." Months passed and life in Winterdale slowly began to stabilize. Denise had returned to her work, and the protests that once filled the streets had subsided, replaced by a cautious optimism for the future. But for Isabel, the fight was far from over. He had become a symbol of justice in the community, a role he hadn't sought but now accepted with a quiet determination. One evening, as he sat in his office, reviewing new proposals for reform in the police department, Denise walked in. She watched him for a moment, her face filled with a mix of pride and concern. "Isabel," she said gently, "you've done enough. You've fought so hard for this town. Maybe it's time to take a step back, to rest." Isabel looked up at her, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "I know, but there's still so much work to be done. This is just the beginning." Denise sighed, sitting down beside him. "I just don't want you to lose yourself in this fight." Isabel took her hand, his expression softening. "I won't. But I can't walk away now, not when there's still more to change." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling around them. "You're a good man," Isabel, Denise said quietly, "and this town is lucky to have you." Isabel squeezed her hand, his heart full of gratitude for the woman who had stood by him through everything. "I'm lucky to have you," he whispered. And as they sat together, Isabel knew that while the battle for justice would never truly end, he was ready for whatever came next. The fight was hard, and the path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Isabel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: weary hope. This was only the beginning, and he was prepared to keep fighting for Winterdale, for justice, and for a better world.